Okay, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, as you know, the state has been presenting witnesses and their evidence in this case. Generally, the state would finish that presentation as we discussed on the first day. That generally the state goes first, they finish all of their evidence, and then the defense presents their evidence. However, the next witness is being called by the defense in this case. We have agreed, you will hear that this witness is from out of town, and just for scheduling purposes and for convenience kind of the presentation, both the state and the defense have agreed that we're taking this witness out of order, basically. So after this witness testifies, we'll switch back and the state will finish its presentation. But just to explain to you that we are taking this out of usual order. So with that, Mr. O'Brien.
Thank you, Your Honor. Ma'am, would you please state your full name?
You need to call her and I need to put her under oath. You have to.
Okay. I just make sure that.
The defense calls Mr. O'Brien.
Dr. Jolie Brams.
And if you would raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony that you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So I hope you got it.
I do.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Your Honor. Doctor, would you give us your full name and spell your full name?
Of course. My name is Dr. Jolie, Jolie Brams, B-R-A-M-S.
And what is your profession?
I'm a licensed clinical psychologist.
Are you licensed to practice your profession in this state?
Yes, and in several others as well.
What other states?
I'm licensed, I have a full license in Texas and Oklahoma, and I have temporary license in other states as well.
What is your license number in the state of Ohio?
3233.
All right. When were you licensed in Ohio?
In 1982.
What area do you specialize in?
Well, I'm a licensed clinical psychologist, and for years, even continuing now, I do what clinical psychologists do, which is assess, for me, a lot of children, adolescents, families, and adults. But for about the last 25 or 30 years, what I primarily have done is forensic psychology, which is the interaction between psychology and the law, basically being a criminal psychologist.
How does that differ from clinical psychology?
Well, there's a very big difference, not only what we do, but also how we do that. As a clinical psychologist, our role is to advocate for our patient. So, for instance, if you came in to see a psychologist for a problem, they would not necessarily believe everything you're saying, but they would be your advocate and they would work in your best interests. You would be their primary concern. A forensic psychologist, my primary concern is the court. No matter who retains me, whether it's the prosecution or the defense or the court, a judge may call me, my responsibility is to provide scientifically based independent evidence for the court system so decisions can be made. So it's a very different role in terms of who's our client. In clinical psychology, it's the patient. Here, it's the court.
We've marked ahead of time, save a little bit of travel between here and there. Do you have some exhibits that have already been marked?
That's correct, sir.
All right. I'm going to ask you to look at Defense Exhibit A. What is that, Doctor?
That is a copy of my resume, my curriculum vitae, and it's 23 pages in length.
All right. Well, we're not going to go through that.
Good.
Its entirety. But let's just skim over the high points. Fair enough?
That's fair, sir.
Where did you begin your basic college education?
I received a bachelor's in psychology from the University of Texas at Austin in 1975, and I graduated with special honors. And then I have a doctorate in clinical psychology with a specialty in child development, and I received that from Michigan State University in 1981.
Have you gotten any other degrees since then?
No, sir.
Okay. How about internships? Have you had any internships? And what is an internship?
Well, an internship is necessary to become a clinical psychologist, very similar to a medical internship. So in order to become a clinical psychologist, you have to do 1 year of internship prior to getting a PhD, which is called predoctoral, and then at least 1 year afterwards. And I ended up doing 2 years predoctoral and 1 year afterwards. I worked at a psychiatric well, actually it was a full medical center in Syracuse, New York, in the Department of Psychiatry. And I also worked for 2 years in Flint, Michigan at Hurley Medical Center, being a pediatric psychologist and consulting with their medical staff there and their own internship program.
So sometime in the mid-'80s, did you leave those internships?
Well, I finished my PhD in '81, so I became licensed. All of that was done by '81. Between 1981 and 1986, and continuing now, but I do this free pro bono, I was a professor at Ohio State University in the medical school, in the Department of Psychiatry, and in pediatrics from '82 to '86. And I'm still teach there for free pro bono in the Department of Psychiatry.
Are you affiliated with any hospitals?
Not currently.
Okay.
Only Ohio State.
That's what I mean.
Yes, yes.
Okay. Now, have you published any articles?
Well, earlier in my career, I published a great deal. More recently, I've become involved, obviously, in criminal forensic psychology, and I recently published 2 peer-reviewed articles regarding the impact of injury upon certain psychiatric symptoms.
Right. All told, how many articles do you think you've had published?
Well, I've written book chapters and books. To tell you the truth, I've never counted. I have probably a book, 25 or more book chapters, and a variety of publications.
Are you a member of any type of organization?
Not right now, no.
Okay.
I'm not. Just
Now,
a licensed psychologist.
Let's call your attention to Mr. William Knight.
Of course.
Have you had a chance to meet Mr. William Knight?
Yes.
Okay. And when did you first meet Mr. William Knight?
I met Mr. Knight in early January, I think January 7th, 2017. And I spent about 6 hours evaluating him.
All right. And what did you do during those 6 hours?
Well, I would do what I would do, Mr. O'Brien, in any situation. The first thing I wanted to do was establish a relationship with him. A forensic interview, it's more than just an interview. You don't want to go in and just say, okay, how old are you? Where were you born? That's not what this is about. My goal in this is to understand this defendant. I have to understand his history, how he thinks, how he perceives situations. So when I come in there, we start talking about anything. I think with Mr. Knight, we talked about his current situation. But as the interview progressed, I go through his early developmental history, his adult history, his current functioning, his mental health. So we're talking about 6 hours of a very involved interview, not only Mr. O'Brien gathering information, but gathering the manner in which he presents that information, gathering information about who he is as a person in terms of his perceptions and his functioning.
Okay. As part of that 6 hours, do you conduct a testing of Mr. Knight?
Yes, part of that time afterwards, he was given a paper and pencil test that's widely accepted in forensic psychology.
Is that part of your evaluation of Mr. Knight?
Yes, it was, sir.
Okay. Now, let's talk, well, first of all, you're not doing this pro bono, are you?
No, I'm not.
All right. And how much do you normally get paid per hour?
$300 an hour.
Okay. Now, your evaluation of Mr. Knight begins how?
Well, of Mr. Knight himself, because I also saw family members as well, but of Mr. Knight, as I stated, I met him in the detention facility. We had a fairly private room so we could conduct this evaluation without being heard or recorded. I started off talking to him, as I stated, as I would any other defendant or any other person, finding out his perceptions about why he's here, asking about his family and his life. And then, over the course of time, I have to understand, the purpose of the evaluation, basically, is to understand the offense behavior, to understand how he got himself to that point in time. That's with Mr. Knight or any other evaluation, to understand the forces that bring any person to a particular place where a decision has to be made in terms of behavior, which is what brought him to the night in March to when this offense occurred.
All right. You indicated that you did some other interviews, is that right?
That's correct, sir.
Who did you interview in addition to Mr. Knight?
I had face-to-face interviews with his daughter, Michelle, and also with his sister, Miss McFall, Nancy.
All right, now, in this evaluation, where do you begin? In a period of time or a period of his life or what?
Well, let me talk about it. It's not so much where the interview began, but there's really 3 areas that I'm concerned about. One of them is his early childhood development, because what happens to us as a child and a growing individual has impact on how we are now. And I think you could look back at anyone's life, and that's pretty formulaic, but it's true. So I need to understand how his personality was formed. How did he learn to make judgments? How does he perceive the world? What are his social skills? What has been his impulse control over time? All of those things. And what impacted him morally, socially, developmentally in the early years of his life.
Okay.
The next thing I look at is his development overall. What was Mr. like? What has he been like as an adult? His work history, his marriage, his relationship with his family, his child, socially, how has he dealt with judgment, reasoning, morality, all of those things. And in the case of Mr. Knight, the last about 15 years of his life have been very central in understanding what occurred on this tragic night. Because there were many things that happened to Mr. Knight in the past 10 or 15 years that not only relate to his past functioning, but are very relevant to the offense behavior.
Now, do you do this type of evaluation in other cases?
Many times. I've been doing this for about well over 30 years.
Right. Have you testified in court before?
Yes, sir, I have.
Can you give us an estimate of how many times?
Well, I've testified in many state courts in Ohio and also state courts all over the United States, many states. I've testified in federal court as well as military courts. As you know, many cases don't go to court, so I've consulted on thousands of cases, but I've probably testified, I don't know how many, more than, 100, 200 times, I don't know.
Okay.
A lot of times, but that's very small in comparison to the number of cases I've evaluated.
Have you been permitted to testify as an expert in these cases?
In all sorts of cases. I've never been excluded, sir.
Okay. Now, let's go back to Mr. Knight, and let's talk about his early days, if I can use that.
Yes.
What did you find from your interviewing him and his daughter and his, well, maybe not his daughter, wouldn't be for his early days, but say...
His sister.
His sister. Is his sister older or younger than he is?
She's older.
Okay. So she would have a chance to look at her younger brother?
Yes, she's about 10 years older than he is.
Okay. What did you find?
Well, let me first start off with generally. I did speak to Mr. Knight at length, as well as family members, about his history. And as a child, and I say continuing today, he was extremely anxious. He was a very dependent young man. He had tremendous anxiety when he had to separate from his mother. She had to quit her job at one point in time because he was scared that she would not be home when she was at school, when he was at school, and she had to be home after he came home. He had a very hard time making friends, very nerdy, for lack of a better word. And the manner in which he was raised was very atypical. He was made to wear a bow tie to school every day, and this was the 1960s. His sister shared that Mr. Knight was not easily able to share the painful aspects of his childhood. His sister reported quite emotionally that both his parents were alcoholic. For some reason, there was a breakup in the family, and he had to live with his grandparents for a couple of years, and they were very abusive to both him and the sisters. She described her brother as adorable but a nerd. She basically, both her report and Mr. Knight's report would indicate a child with overwhelming anxiety, very poor social skills, and an inability to advocate or speak up for himself. One of the most difficult stories, and his sister knew something was wrong but didn't really, is that Mr. Knight reported that he was abused physically by his elementary school principal, who used to beat him with a board. And the manner in which he described this physical abuse, I have no evidence to say that this is true, but it bordered on pseudo-sexual. There was something pleasurable, you could tell from the principal's perspective. This was a very odd situation, and Mr. Knight could not advocate. He could not go to his parents. He could not tell anyone. He just stood and took it. So what we have here is a child who was socially unskilled, extremely nervous. I can't go back and diagnose someone 65 years ago, but I believe he would have met a criteria from what I hear of having an anxiety disorder at a minimum as a child. So that is what he was like as a child. He was basically given little direction, probably abused to some degree, socially inept. And that was what he was like as a little boy. As he became a teenager, he tried to tell me he'd stand up for himself, but the manner in which he shared it was very almost hapless and pathetic. You know, he kept telling me I knew how to fight for myself, but the manner in which he shared this, he was trying to show me he could be a man, but he was just fairly passive and naive.
Judge, a housekeeping matter. Based upon the doctor's training, education, and experience, I would ask that the court allow her to testify as an expert in her field.
Any objection?
No objection.
I will find that the doctor is qualified as an expert in her field.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Doctor, moving along chronologically, can we move on to, if I can call it either teenage years or middle adulthood?
Certainly.
What did you find then?
Well, Mr. Knight had been married to his wife Karen for, 40 plus years. Karen was the first woman that he ever really met or spoke to, much less dated. And he was a very loyal husband throughout the course of the marriage. Mr. Knight has worked semi-skilled jobs throughout his life. He was a laborer and a construction worker for the majority of his life, sometimes working for a company, sometimes doing odd jobs here and there. He presents as someone who has low average intelligence, probably better mechanical skills, but he lived a very rigid life. He and Karen basically their life was very constricted. When he wasn't working, every day he would see his mother at the same time. He'd go by the house and have coffee with her every morning. He told me that they traveled very little. He and Karen were afraid to go many places. He spoke very emotionally that all he has wanted to do in his life was go to a Cleveland Indians baseball game, but he was scared to go because he thought it was too dangerous to park and to walk to the stadium. So he never went to saw an Indians game, even though he watched it on TV and very much wanted to go. So he and Karen lived a very rigid life. Karen had the same job for about 42 years. There really was not very much change in their life until Karen became ill, and that was about 15 years ago, and his wife became desperately ill and hung on for about 10 or 15 years, but needed a great deal of attention and nurturing, which this gentleman did give her. Very, very difficult time. And so that was their life, and once Karen got sick, he basically gave up everything. They eventually moved to subsidized housing. He couldn't work as much. He had a quintuple bypass, five bypass open heart surgery. His diabetes became worse, and she had throat cancer, which spread. She needed nursing. And basically for about the last, I would say 10 to 15 years, she was on and off. His life was taking care of his wife, in addition to worrying about his daughter, which is another part of this whole story.
Well, why don't you tell us about what you found about the relationship between Mr. Knight and his daughter?
Certainly. Mr. Knight and Karen had only one child, which is Michelle. And they wanted to have more, they could not. So this was very much their prized child. Mr. Knight has felt protective toward Michelle throughout her whole life. I need to say that I interviewed Michelle, and in turn, she is not appreciative of her father's protectiveness at all. And in turn, he tries to be increasingly protective, and then in turn, she becomes less grateful for what she sees are her father's intrusions. But nevertheless, he did everything possible to take care of his daughter and do what he felt was right by her. He also has a grandson who's a teenager named Seth, and according to what I can find out, Seth seems to have somewhat similar problems that Mr. Knight did as a child. Very anxious, he's being homeschooled, he seems to have some problems, and Mr. Knight feels, of course, very worried and protective about Seth as well. So he was the best father he can be, but this is not a gentleman with a great deal of great problem-solving abilities. I hate to say this in front of him, he's not highly intelligent. He's a very anxious, rigid, kind of simplistic individual.
What did you discover, if anything, about his, let's say, his latter adult years or maybe the last 15 years?
Well, as I noted, the last 15 years are one in which his role was to be a protector.
Let me stop you there. How old is Mr. Knight?
He's in his early 60s.
Okay. I would suggest he was 63 in March of 2017, would that sound about right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay.
Yes.
He's about 64 now?
Yes. I didn't know he was 63 or 64, and I was sitting here trying to guess his birthday, but you're right.
Please continue.
Okay. So when he was in his 50s, his wife became very ill. She had throat cancer, multiple surgeries. She was in a coma for 3 months. But what happened to Mr. Knight is he just basically turned all of his energy onto protecting Karen and being there for her. I know she had some nursing through Medicaid. She had a little bit of in-home help. The daughter came by sometimes. But for the most part, the worry and care was on Mr. Knight. And he became more physically debilitated. His diabetes became worse. As noted, he had a heart attack and he had to have a 5 bypass surgery. Their financial situation was in ruins. They lived in a home, then they were in subsidized housing. Now what has happened to Mr. Knight is he had to move out of housing into a trailer, and he has never been able to get over the loss of Karen. Until he was incarcerated, he visited his wife's grave 4 or 5, 6 times a week, sometimes more. He never really moved on in any type of way. This is a man who was grieving for Karen, and all he had left in his life was his daughter. It was basically all that he had that was meaningful to him.
In his life, whether it's young, middle, or older, I said, did he ever indicate to you there were some certain pivotal or important events in his life that maybe caused a certain turning point?
Well, I think that there were turning points. I think when his daughter was born, that was a huge positive issue in his life and how much he wanted to have that child. When he found out that Karen was terminal, I think that his life changed completely. I think it was beyond what he could grasp that he would lose his wife. I think those were turning points in terms of the way that he looked at himself, but also just in terms of his mental and physical health, especially with Karen.
Okay. Just a second, Judge, to do a little mechanical work here. Doctor, on your screen there you have, let's say, call it a graph.
That's correct, sir.
Okay. And you have an exhibit in front of you that's marked Exhibit C as in Charlie.
That's correct.
All right. Would you please review that?
Yes, that is a copy of the personality assessment inventory.
If I can refer to that, is this part of your testing?
Yes, that is the test. This is a 344-item test. It has 4 different answer points, whether answers are true, mostly not true, or false. And it's been given to wide populations of people. For example, if you want to have a certain security clearance, you may take this test. A managerial position, we give it oftentimes in court situations. And what it is, it's a personality screening that has been widely accepted and utilized, as I noted, in business, courts, and also in clinical practice. And what this is, what you're looking at is one part of a graph. It's a 2-page form denoting where his scores lie. And the reason I did this, why you do this in a forensic evaluation, is you want to get independent evaluation of who that person is beyond just what you're hearing from the family or from the defendant.
What's the name of this test?
It's called the Personality Assessment Inventory, or PAI.
Okay. Now, first of all, I've got, I believe, side A up there. Is that correct?
It's hard to see, but yes, that's correct.
All right. Can you see it?
I can see my copy, yes.
Can everybody in the jury see it?
Good.
All right. Doctor, in layman's terms, please, can you explain what's on this graph?
Certainly. This graph, and there'll be one more page that you will see, shows where his test scores lie in comparison to people who have problems or don't have problems, what we call a normative population. So for instance, if I go to the doctor and I'm 5'4" and I weigh 170 pounds, my weight is going to be above average for a woman my age. It may not be exceedingly high, but it's going to be somewhere moderately high, and you then can look at my health and predict certain things based upon where I fall on that scale, because you're comparing me to other women my age at my weight, and that would allow you to do that. That's sort of what the PAI does. Now what's important is these first 3 scales that you see there's 4 dots and then a big line. There's a little thing that goes down and then up. Those are what we call validity scales. And those are probably one of the most important aspects of this testing. What validity scales are is they're measures as to whether the defendant or anyone taking it was truthful and forthcoming in their test taking. Because if they're not truthful, the rest of the test really should not be interpreted, or at least interpreted very carefully.
What did you interpret it as?
Well, it's not what I interpret it as. His scores came out very different than most people evaluated in criminal situations. And I've done this for years, and I've testified in this and looked at this. These scores that you're looking at, the first score is what we call inconsistency. And
Is there any, to help, is there a pen that you're, a
yeah,
pencil?
I can go try to find a pen. Sure.
Without, because you can mark on that screen.
Okay.
In fact, you just use your finger
Okay.
there. You can-
Okay, if you see, how do I get rid of that then now?
Okay, so in the corner.
Eraser. In the corner it says clear. Hold on.
Erase.
I see eraser. Oh, here.
Yes.
A clear screen.
Mr. Brams.
There we go, got it. I love technology, I've not done this one before. If you look at these scores here, okay, what you'll see here are 4 dots. And you'll see a line right there.
I didn't break
And
it.
what you'll see is very few of these dots are anywhere near this second line here. They're low scores. And those low scores are very unusual to find in a so-called criminal population, because it means that the person taking that test, took it in a valid manner. They did not try to make themselves look good. They did not try to make themselves look bad. Because there's 2 ways that you could try to fake out a test to look good for the court. Because many defendants, their goal is to look good for the court. They either can make themselves look good, for instance, never admitting a flaw, saying they go to church every Sunday, that if I found $1 on the street, they return it to the owner. Okay, these are things that are obviously attempts at making yourself look good. Mr. Knight did not do those things. I'd love to clear this screen, but that's okay. Instead, he also didn't try to make himself look crazy. A lot of defendants will say, I hear voices, I think my mother's a turtle, everybody's out to get me, all of these things, and we know that they are trying to make themselves look like they have problems, so either they'll go to a mental hospital or the judge will give them a lesser sentence or whatever. Unusually, for the population that I work with, Mr. Knight's validity scores were well within normal limits. He made no effort to look good for me or for the court or to look bad. He also answered his questions consistently. There's the first little dot there is about an infrequency or inconsistency score. So it wasn't like he first said, I like mechanics, and a half hour later he says, I don't like mechanics. He was very consistent of what he stated. He had thought through this test. So what I know about his test taking is he thought about what he was answering, and he answered honestly, which is rare to see when you have a situation where there's the death of an individual.
This type of test, is this part of a standard set of tests, or is it an independent type of test?
Well, it's given independently. It's a very, very good measure of understanding psychological and behavioral issues in all kinds of populations.
What do you mean by independently?
Well, I don't know what you mean by independently. I'm saying that, do I give it with other tests? Or are you saying...
That's my question.
Well, it can be given with other tests, but the question here before the court was not, let's say, Mr. Knight's intellectual functioning or other issues. So I've given this with other tests, but in most situations such as this, for my work, this test would be administered by itself in conjunction with family interviews and an extensive interview of Mr. Knight, which I did.
Okay. So this wasn't necessarily part of let's say, an IQ test or battery test?
No, not at all. This was a way for me to be an independent evaluator for the court, to not only rely upon my own forensic or clinical findings, or what Ms. McFall said or Ms. Gill said, but basically to enhance my findings. Now, the court needs to understand, the jury, that if this test came out different than my forensic findings, I would definitely address that issue.
So this is kind of a backup to your interviews?
No, I would not use the backup. It's an enhancement. It's a way for me to make sure that my findings make sense, and it's also a way for me to find out more about the person I'm evaluating.
Please continue.
Okay, so the other scales here, if you go down throughout here, measure different attributes, different personality attributes. And as you can see, the line here, very few of his scores are way above even a moderate amount of disturbance. One of the things that is of significance on this is this first scale, which is what we call somatizing. And it's basically people that have a lot of physical problems either because they have them or because they're depressed.
Can you spell that word, please?
Yes, it's S-O-M-A-T-I, somatic, S-O-M-A-T-I-C, somatic. It's a somatic scale. And it's not surprising, given that he had a quintuple bypass and that his wife died and he has diabetes, that you would find that moderate elevation. What's important is that he's not using those things to make himself look, favorable to other people or to the court. They seem to be true representations of his physical state. What is really most interesting, though, is can we turn to the second page of this?
Would that be referred to as side B?
Side B, yes.
Okay.
If you refer to side B, there are two things that I think that are significant, several things that are significant in understanding this gentleman.
Excuse me, let me
Go ahead.
get this over, folded a little better.
You got that? Okay.
Got it.
Okay. I think that the most important is if you look at these scales in here, they look at trauma. And he clearly presents with a lot of trauma responses. These trauma responses would be being hypervigilant, being anxious, feeling the world is unsafe, having had bad things happen to him. And much of this likely relates from just his general vulnerability, as well as the loss of his wife, and also his current legal situation. So those were not surprising scores, but they're important. He also presents with a reasonable degree of depression, not something that I would be worried about terribly, although he does score a little high on some suicidal potential, but it's not a level of depression that would be something that would have negated his ability to live his life, but it certainly shows that he has feelings and concerns about his current situation. What is the most important part of this entire evaluation is these last scales in here, right in here, and that is the aggression scales. And these scales measure violent tendencies, whether they're verbal tendencies or physical aggression tendencies, and he has scored remarkably low on those scales. In my forensic experience, don't think I've ever seen a defendant who's been accused of this type of offense ever score that low on either the tendency for verbal aggression, physical aggression, or violent thoughts. So you have here somebody who answered this test very honestly and admits to having some physical problems, some depression, some trauma. All of that seems very much in line with who he is, but at the same time, his propensity for violence is extremely low.
Based upon your evaluation of him, your interviews with his sister and his daughter, your testing of him, would you consider Mr. Knight a violent or predatory person?
Based upon my evaluation of him and his history, I see nothing in his history that would suggest a propensity to violence, probably just the opposite, a propensity to withdrawal and anxiety. And my forensic conclusion is backed up by this testing, which indicates not only a direct and valid test-taking approach, but basically no tendencies for either physical or verbal violence or violent ideation thoughts.
How does he regard his daughter?
He loves his daughter very much, but he sees her as someone who's made poor decisions in her life. He's not happy with her decisions. He feels that he always has to be her protector, that she's always going to do something to sort of, I can't remember if he used the word mess up or screw up, but that he feels that he always has to be there to protect her because he doesn't really trust her decisions.
Doctor, based upon your education, your experience, your training, your interviews with Mr. Knight, his sister, and his daughter, do you have a professional opinion of how Mr. Knight perceived and responded to the situation of the evening of March 20th, 2017.
Yes, I do, sir.
Yes, she has an opinion.
And what is that opinion?
Approach, please. Based upon a lack of foundation, the objection will be sustained.
Doctor, for purposes of background and foundation, what is your understanding of what happened the night of March 20th, 2017 in Goodyear Heights on Dan Mead in the city of Akron, county of Summit?
Okay, I'll give you a summary. I'm not the police report, but there was a stolen motorcycle that Mr. Knight's son-in-law wanted to recover.
Who's his son-in-law?
Is Curtis Gill, that he wanted to recover the motorcycle. The motorcycle had been advertised, I believe, on Facebook. It's fairly common to have these things happen. Through a friend, they found out where the bike probably was. There was an arrangement made to try to recover the stolen bike. And Mr. Gill, Curtis, had asked his father-in-law to help with the situation because Mr. Knight had a pickup truck and the bike could be put in the back of the pickup truck. And they all went out and a series of events occurred. There were telephone calls. I'm sure the court has already heard about this. But basically, Mr. Knight and his son-in-law in a separate vehicle and his daughter, who was in that separate vehicle, arrived where the motorcycle was. There was some moving around. There were some various people involved. There was a crowd of people that gathered. The crowd of people were basically cohorts of the individual, the victim, who had the motorcycle in his possession. There were some tensions that ensued. The bike had been pressed against Curtis Gill. Meanwhile, Mr. Knight had his truck at one side of the street. It was facing where the motorcycle was. He observed several things. He saw the mayhem starting to occur. He observed his son-in-law being pressed with the bike. Then Mr. Johnson took the bike, revved up the bike, went down, kind of curved around one side of the street, and was heading down toward where Mr. Knight perceives his daughter was, and was riding this bike at a high rate of speed. Mr. Knight was down the street in his pickup truck, had a concealed carry, he had the gun out. He fired a warning shot. He fired another shot, which ended up killing the victim. I'm not the police, but that's the general scenario.
Okay. Now, Doctor, based upon your training, experience, education, your interviews with Mr. Knight, interviews with the sister and his daughter, what would you expect an individual to react or respond to a situation like this?
A normal reaction for any of us would be fear. A normal reaction would be feeling that they're in a situation that's very uncomfortable and novel for them and being afraid as to what would be the next thing that would happen. I think that would be a normal reaction for any of us.
And what would that fear be?
Well, the fear would be for harm for either someone we loved or for ourselves.
And who would that be?
Well, in this situation, the fear clearly for Mr. Knight would be the loss of his daughter, which is the only person he loves in his life that's left for him, and who's been very protective of. And I can tell you based on my interview, that was his fear, is that he would lose this daughter, and his son would basically, his grandson would be without a mother.
Was he also concerned about his son-in-law?
Of course.
Then, if he lost his daughter and son-in-law, then his grandson is...
An orphan. Yes.
Doctor, did you compile your findings and your opinions in a report?
Yes, I did, sir.
All right, and that report was dated December 15th, 2017?
Yes, and I also misspoke. I saw him in November of 2017, and then I wrote my report. I think I testified I saw him in January, but I wasn't reading my handwriting correctly.
All right. So you have in front of you Exhibit A is your curriculum vitae.
That's correct.
Defense Exhibit B is your report of December 15.
That's correct, sir.
And Exhibit C is your testing graph.
That's correct.
All right. These were all prepared by yourself as part of this work?
Yes.
Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Mrs. Brams.
Good afternoon.
Is it Dr. Brams?
It's doctor.
I'm sorry.
But I'm not going to take offense.
That's all right.
Just don't call me older than I am and I'll be fine.
I won't be calling you anything, trust me. Dr. Brams, my name is John Baumel. I'm an assistant county prosecutor. We've never met before. Is that accurate?
That's correct. I've seen your name. I've heard your name.
Okay. And as far as, I guess I want to start out and talk a little bit about your business, your employment. And are you a forensic psychologist, a criminal psychologist, or I guess what would be your actual title that you would go by?
Well, licensing in Ohio and in most states, you're licensed as a clinical psychologist, just like you're licensed as a physician. It's a general license. But I do hold myself as a forensic psychologist because for the last 30 or so years, the majority of my practice has been forensic psychology. I teach attorneys forensic psychology. I've been qualified in many courts. I've written articles. So yes, what I do, the specialty area that I focus in is forensic psychology.
So the answer is yes to that.
The answer is yes.
In regards to your business, I mean, you have a nice website, right, where you advertise your business?
Well, I don't consider it advertising. Attorneys need something to look at, courts, judges look at it. But yes, I guess you call it advertising. I don't really need any business, but it's more to get a way for people to get my curriculum vitae, to see what we do, those type of things.
Well, you have a website called Brams and Associates, in which you have many different sections to that website, correct?
That's correct.
And you have our practice areas, and do you have a copy of
I know
that?
what's on my website.
You know what's on your website?
Of course I do.
Perfect. Then you'll know that what you're trying to get is attorneys to hire you to assist in their cases, correct?
I want attorneys to hire me, prosecutors to hire me, agencies to hire me. They all do. But I have to have some way of getting the information out, so of course I have a website.
Sure, and I'm not questioning your website. I'm just going to talk about what's on the website.
I like my website. I think I have a good picture.
And I think before you said it's not an advertisement, but clearly it is a way to get the word out to get hired, correct?
Yeah, I don't want to play words, and you can say yes, of course, anyone having a website, it's an advertisement. But at this point in my career, I'm not looking to advertise. What I find, though, is when people ask about my services, it's just a great way to communicate information. If they want to hire me, Mr. Valmol, that's great.
Sure.
But I don't look at really as advertising at this point. I mean, I have a national practice. I've done this for 35 years. But I'm trying to tell people the areas that I practice in. So you can look at it anyway. I don't take offense. I just don't really see it as advertising.
And on your website, I won't call it advertising again, I promise. In regards to your practice areas, you have civil litigation and criminal proceedings, correct?
That's correct, sir.
And you list a number of fields that you specialize in, correct?
Or that I've testified in, yes.
And for civil litigation, which that's not really forensic science, correct? Civil litigation?
Oh, absolutely it is.
And you have 21 different areas, is that correct?
I've never counted, but if they're on there, yes.
21 different areas. You have talking about injuries from motor vehicle accidents, injuries due to wrongful discharge, injuries from sexual harassment. Those are a couple of the 21 examples of fields that you put on your website for civil litigation.
That's correct, sir.
And you also have criminal proceedings, and you have 18 different areas of criminal proceedings, correct?
I've never counted, but that sounds right.
Approximately 18?
Probably.
And you have domestic violence, not guilty by reason of insanity, substance abuse, sexual abuse. You have a wide range of fields, is that fair to say?
That's fair to say.
And although this isn't an advertisement, you even have a section of stories where you've been successful, is that correct?
That's correct.
You have an area, a section in your website tells you how to retain you, is that
That's correct. That's correct.
And in this case, you indicated that you were billing $300 an hour. Well, let me take a step back. When you have those criminal proceedings and you have a list, I mean, one of the subjects listed is not self-defense. Is that correct?
Well, there's battered women syndrome, but no, I don't think I have self-defense on there, no.
And you indicated you got $300 an hour. And how many hours have you put in for this case?
Well, my billing person was not there today because I was going to come up with a bill, but I would say I've billed about $5,000 or $6,000, something like that.
And does that, I thought you billed by the hour.
I do, so I'm adding up how many hours. I don't know the hours, my billing.
$5,000 or $6,000? Is that correct?
Approximately, yes.
And does that include your testimony here today, or is that prior to testifying?
It may be prior to testifying.
Okay. And is $300 an hour, is that what you charge for any of these areas of civil litigation or criminal proceedings that you get hired for to assist lawyers or judges or what have you?
Yes.
I mean, a good part of you, it seems like a good part of your, and correct me if I'm wrong, a good part of your professional career is working with pediatrics.
Well, that's an important point, and I'm glad you bring that up. Yes, one of the reasons that people, I hate to hire me, retain me, is because of a very strong background in development. And I was a pediatric psychologist. I worked at Children's Hospital, which is now Nationwide Children's Hospital, for many years.
And why did you leave that position?
Because I wanted to go into private practice. I did not want to continue working in academics. That's what I thought my career would be. And you talk about pivotal moments. I felt that I really wanted to work more on the clinical side, and so I left the university.
Okay. In regards to sources of information on this case, and you would agree with me that your opinions, some of the opinions that you've expressed, they're only as good as the information you receive, correct?
And my ability to interpret that, yes.
Well, when we talked about the facts of this case, correct?
Say that again, sir, I'm sorry.
When you talked about the facts of what happened in this case, and your opinion based upon those facts, your opinion's only as credible or as valuable if you have those facts correct.
Yes, but the recitation I gave was a general recitation of what occurred.
Okay. But once again, if you have a fact wrong, and it could be a significant fact, that could change your opinion significantly.
It would never change my opinion about his psychological functioning because this gentleman is who he is.
Well,
so we're not talking, you're asking me if it would change my forensic opinion about Mr. Knight. No, because what I evaluated about him, whether he was in the courtroom or not, that would be who he would be.
So no matter what facts I told you, when you gave your opinion about what he would feel on that, on that day, that would not change no matter what facts I told you about this case.
What I'm stating is that
But I'm asking you the question I'm asking.
it would depend what facts those were.
Exactly.
Yes.
So what facts you have, whether they're accurate, whether they're correct, that could change that final opinion that you had about Mr. Knight at the time of that incident.
That is possible.
And you interviewed the defendant, I believe it was a 6-hour meeting or a 6-hour interview?
I have to go back and look, but I probably evaluated him, spoke to him directly for probably about 6 hours, and I sat there and he took his test.
And it's fair to say that you're not interviewing him in a vacuum. I think you incorrectly said January of 2017.
It was I was reading my notes. I can't read my own notes. It was a 1 and a 1, but it was November.
But clearly you interviewed him after this incident and after his arrest.
Of course.
And so when you're interviewing him, it's not in a vacuum. He has a bias and he has ultimately a motive or a goal as to what's going to happen with this case. Is that fair to say?
I think anyone would, yes.
And for like insanity, a person who's pleading not guilty by reason of insanity, they might want to look like they're crazy, correct?
Well, that's a very important point because I do a lot of insanity defenses, and my professional responsibility is to look at malingering, to look at what we talked about today, making yourself look good, making yourself look bad. So obviously, we have to take all of that into account. I've done many insanity defenses. I'm doing 3 right now, so.
But his goal was not to look crazy in this case, correct?
Well, that would have been, let me comment, I can't give a yes or no. I can state that there would have been benefits for him to look, in quotes, crazy. I hate to use that term. Of course there would be.
You were not hired to do an insanity evaluation, though, is that correct?
No, but there would have been benefits for this defendant, for Mr. Knight, to have looked mentally ill in order to gain the sympathies of this evaluator in the court. There would have been advantages.
And this is not a case in which he's claiming he didn't do it, and so whether he's a good guy or a bad guy is not as important as to whether he did it or didn't do it, correct?
Well, I disagree with that. I think that...
Well, let me ask you this. Can a good guy commit a crime?
Of course.
Can a good guy kill somebody?
Yes.
You also talked with his daughter and his sister, correct?
That's correct.
And would you agree with me that they also would have biases in this case?
Yes.
You'd also talked about his work history, and I think of work as a place where I spend most of my waking hours, at least more than anywhere else.
I know the feeling.
You know the feeling as well. Did you talk to anybody in regards to his 40 years of employment?
No, I did not.
Did you request to have his work records or any information as to who he might have interacted with during those 40 years?
No, I did not.
What about his neighbors? Did you try to get names of people that he's lived by for years and may have had interactions with him during his adulthood?
No.
So the sources of information are Mr. Knight, his sister, and his daughter, correct?
That's correct.
I'm going to kind of try to go through your report in chronological order. You have different sections, correct?
Yes.
And the first section being relevant developmental history.
Yes.
And you talk about his elementary school days and his claim that he was physically and emotionally abused by the principal, correct?
That's correct.
And he went so far as to say that he had, his beatings were so bad by this principal that he had back problems into adulthood.
That's what he reported. That's correct.
And as far as these back problems and him providing a history maybe to a medical provider, did you look into any corroboration that he had been to a doctor, to a hospital, and when they would have said, hey, what happened to your back? There may have been a reference prior to any of this happening of what happened to him with this principal.
No, I did not.
So no medical records, correct?
That's correct.
There is no corroboration besides what Mr. Knight told you as it pertains to that principal.
That's correct.
He also told you that this principal had a group of thugs, older boys, who were on safety patrol and they would do the principal's bidding.
That's what he reported, yes.
So that the principal actually has students in the school, what I interpreted from your report, physically attacking, abusing Mr. Knight.
That's his report. And just as an added issue, his sister was fairly clear that he was not living in a protected type of environment. So, you know, the fact that he did not report this would not be surprising given what both he and his sister reported.
But his sister does not report the principal's activity.
That's correct.
And his sister, did you say was 11 years older?
Again, 10 years, something like that.
Approximately 10,
Yes.
11 years. And if I remember from your report, she moved out of the house when she was 16.
Somewhere around there, yes.
Okay. So do you know when she moved out whether she still had involvement with the family, or at that point is she no longer able to interact and see what's going on with William and the rest of the family?
No, she had moved out to escape an abusive situation, but she still had contact with her brother, yes.
He also told you that in regards to this gang from the principal, that he had his cousin's teeth knocked out by this gang of students.
That's what he reported.
And did you make contact with this cousin to see if there was any truth to that?
No, I did not.
And I think you testified on direct that you had no evidence that this was true on direct examination.
That's correct. That's correct.
I mean, right now, your source of information is solely William Knight.
Right.
And he could be being untruthful in regards to that information.
Or he could be misperceiving situations because of mental health concerns, which is a very reasonable hypothesis.
There's several options, correct? He could be untruthful. Is that an option?
He could be, yes.
He could be exaggerating, correct?
That's possible.
He could be misrepresenting the situation, correct?
Based upon the way his perceptions of his brain, his personality and his functioning works, yes.
And when we talked about the test that he took, and you said it showed that he wasn't being untruthful or malingering, those aren't questions about his past. Those aren't factual questions about what happened to his childhood, correct?
No, those are test-taking approaches that have psychometric, statistical validity. We know that we can testify about them in court, we can use them clinically, and I do know that his test-taking approach, which is usually suggestive of someone's personality, is that it was an honest approach to that test.
Okay. So I just wanted to be clear that it's not like he's under a polygraph test and you're asking him what happened with the principal and he tests that he's telling you.
No, of course not.
Well, it's of course not to you or me maybe, but to the jury,
Okay.
They might not know all the questions that you ask, as whether it pertains to specific events in his life. Is that fair?
Right.
And I mean, you conclude in your report that the principal's behavior, and I think you sound direct, would be sexual sadistic motivation. Is that right?
if you, based upon my forensic experience, the manner in which he talked about this would suggest that there was, if this story is correct, that there was more to this relationship between Mr. Knight and the principal than just a physical abusive relationship.
Well, in potentially classifying this principal as having sexual sadistic motivation, did you try to contact the school, any classmates, anything, before you put this in your report that this principal may have sexual sadistic motivation? Did you have any other corroboration?
No, the principal obviously is deceased, and this gentleman's classmates are all elderly.
And you would agree with me, there's two sides to every story, correct?
There are, but I think the most important aspect here is to understand whether or not that's correct, is that Mr. Knight looks at himself as a vulnerable individual, that is part of his
We'll get
psychological
to all that
pattern.
area and questions, I promise you, but when I'm talking about the principal incident, which you put down in your report, you described the principal potentially as sexually sadistic motivation. It's based on Mr. Knight's description.
Based upon his descriptions, yes.
And in high school, you indicate that he tried to defend himself in fights in high school.
That's correct.
So he is now indicating that he now has physical confrontations in high school.
Because people were making fun of him. He was always the brunt of,
So physical confrontations in elementary school, physical confrontations in high school, and he is the victim and everyone else is the aggressor. Is that how they're described to you?
no. And if the elementary school story is true, he was clearly a victim. He never even reported that to his parents. He would hide in the woods. He was very much, if this is correct in elementary school, he would be the victim. In high school, he got himself into tussles because people would pick on him and he would try to defend himself, but he was not the aggressor. He was responding to them teasing him.
Okay. I mean, I thought that's what I said, that he was defending himself and he was not the aggressor.
I didn't hear that. Well, I heard you say the opposite.
All right. Well, if I did, I apologize. So there's plenty of physical confrontations in his youth, and you put in your report that during the course of your interview, he attempted, and I think it was in reference to what was going on in high school, he tried to prove himself as a man, correct? Is that in your report? And you even said that was sad. I mean, what does that mean to you that he's trying to prove that he's a man?
All I'm saying is that when he was discussing his issues in high school and about being made fun of and all of those things, when he talked to me years and years later, he's trying to tell me that he tried to defend himself, that he really was in much better physical shape, that he really could defend himself at times, but it was very hapless. It was very, I hate to say this with Mr. Knight in the courtroom, but it was sort of embarrassing to hear. He was trying to make himself to be more capable than he ever was.
I mean, to me, being a man or saying I want to be a man in these fighting situations is to be tough, to protect people, to be a hero. Would that fall in line to what you think is someone saying, when you put in your report that he was trying to be a man in these fights?
All I know is he was trying to protect himself in high school. I don't think he did very well. And when he was talking to me, and that's the important thing, when he was talking to me, he was trying to look as if he had been cool or had been capable, and it didn't appear from the forensic interview that that was really what was going on, that in actuality in high school, it was difficult for him to protect himself.
And you say you don't think he did very well in those fights.
It's only by his
It's
report.
by his word. For all you know, he's beaten up somebody in high school in one of those fights.
Anything is possible.
So we get to the adult life, and I know you indicated the example that he said he wouldn't go to Cleveland Indians games, and I think you put in there that he was convinced that the neighborhood was dangerous and that people would be killed if they parked by the stadium, correct?
Yes.
This is not might be killed, this is would be killed.
Well, it could be would. Don't take every word in that. Might be killed, could be killed, but it was basically dangerous.
But your report says would be killed. Is that? And you can look at your report. If
Yeah,
you
I know
want.
what it says. I know what it says. I think that the point is that Mr. Knight felt that if he and his wife parked in the neighborhood and went to a Cleveland Indians game, that this is a place that people would be killed, could be killed, that it was a dangerous situation.
Did you explore to him about what type of neighborhood it was where the Indians games took place?
Yes, I did.
And was there a part of that neighborhood that brought him to be fearful?
Well, he never really had seen the neighborhood, but he had heard about the parking, and he knew that it was not in a good place in Cleveland. According to him, the important point is not where the parking is in the Indians game. The important point is how he perceived his life and why it was so rigid and why he was so fearful and so protective.
Would you say that's an unreasonable fear?
Of course.
And did you explore race relations with Mr. Knight?
No, I did not.
I mean, were you aware, it's been told and asked of every juror that there's overtones, undertones of race in this case. Did you explore with him at all whether there were African Americans in his school?
No, I did not.
Whether there are African Americans in his workplace?
Well, I did not, because I did not see this as a racial case. This is a case of a decision being made on a dark road where it's a difficult situation. I did not really see this. I had no issue with Mr. Knight. It didn't appear to me to be a racial issue. It appeared to me to be a mental health issue and a decision-making issue.
But let's assume he had previous conflict, you talked about his childhood. Let's say he had previous conflicts in his childhood.
Right.
Dealing with a certain race. Would that at all be relevant in your opinion and in your assessment?
Well, he never made any racial comments whatsoever. He never brought up anything about race whatsoever. He was very socially isolated. He had few friends growing up. Whatever race they may be, this is not somebody who had a lot of social contact. I don't see him as very political. He's sort of a hapless, sort of low IQ, very simplistic kind of guy. I did not even really look at this as a racial issue.
Okay, but you didn't explore that issue or make any questions in regards to that field. Is that fair to say?
That's correct.
In regards to section number 2, mental health profile test results,
Okay.
you conclude, or you state in the second paragraph, it would be an exaggeration to state that he is paranoid, but he is anxious, suspicious, on edge, and may misinterpret situations. Is that fair?
That's very fair, yes.
On page 4, the last line, you talk about whether or not he reaches the specific criteria for a diagnosis on the autism
Wait,
spectrum.
can I interrupt you? You're looking at page 4 and I'm not seeing that, sir.
It's the first paragraph. It's a continuation from the paragraph before.
Page 4?
Unless my,
Are you looking at page 3, you mean under number 2?
it's on number 2, but it's on top of my page 4. Maybe
Let's see. I've got page 3 here, and then I've got this. What do you have? This is what, can I reach over? Sure. I mean, is that what you're looking at here?
No, I'm looking up here. Well, you're on page, no, you're at page 4,
Okay.
and then the last one.
Oh, you told me the last one, that's at the end of the page. Okay.
We got the same report, right?
Yes, we do.
All right. Page 4, and I'll just read it word for word. Whether or not he reaches the specific criteria for a diagnosis on the autism spectrum, his functioning does raise concerns about his ability to make good judgments in stressful situations.
That's correct.
You also indicated, and I think in this area, and you testified on direct about any propensity for violence. Is that correct? You saw no. How would you quantify his propensity for violence?
Well, I'm not here to quantify his propensity, his future violence. But if you look at his history, there's no history of violence in his record. He has no criminal record. His test scores showed less propensity of violence than anyone I've tested in years in a forensic situation. There's no violence reported by his sister or his daughter. There was no domestic violence. I asked his daughter about that. There's just nothing in his history that would suggest that he acts out in a violent manner in any area of his life or has thoughts about doing so.
And you several times have said this is, the lowest scores I've ever seen in my career, or one of the lowest.
No, in a long time, it's rare.
If I can finish the sentence, these tests are standardized tests, is that correct?
That's correct.
And so is there also standardized, calculations throughout the country as to where he would fall on these testings?
Well, yes, I can tell you where.
And you didn't provide that. You're just telling us based upon your experience, and we're relying on your other cases. We don't have any information on your other cases, do we?
That's not, okay. May I answer, you're asking a multiple question.
Okay, I'll ask one at a time then.
There are norms that I'm comparing these scores that you're looking at here on the screen are normative data. So I'm comparing all those lines you see are compared to tens of thousands of other subjects and comparing them. It's like taking an IQ test. That's normative data.
And did you provide us with that data?
It's on the normative data is on those scales. When you look at those charts, you can see where the percentiles
Well, the
are.
other people are. But in regards to when you're talking about your career and patients you've seen, we have to rely on that. Is that correct?
Okay. Well, that's correct, but let me also add that the research there's a lot of research about these scales in terms of all kinds of criminal populations, death penalty cases, all kinds of cases. And if you look at the use of the PAI in other forensic situations, you will also find that his scores are atypical for many of those other defendants as well. So it's not just my experience. I'm giving my experience because I've had a lot of experience.
Sure.
But both based upon the norms, you've got the norms on here, and then you have research studies. So people take groups of people and study them, murder defendants, whoever, and they look at those scores, and his PAI is atypical because one, he had a very honest approach, and two, he scores very low on all of those violence scales.
In regards to the violence scale, were you aware of him carrying a .357 revolver and having 2 speed loaders on his person?
Yes, I know he's a concealed carry, yes, and I know he has guns, of course.
What about the speed loaders?
I knew he had a speed loader, yes.
In regards to his feelings towards Curtis Gill, could you tell us about that?
I don't think he particularly likes his son-in-law. I don't think he wanted Michelle to marry him. I think that's been an issue. He's always had fears that Curtis doesn't treat Michelle right. He's very protective. He looks, and this gets to his level. We talked about this, his anxiety. It's not paranoia. It's this unease. It's the protectiveness. It's this fear. It's this vulnerability. And he believes, right or wrongly, that Curtis doesn't treat Michelle right. I don't have any proof of that. The most important thing for my evaluation is that's how he perceives the situation, which makes him even more protective as time goes on.
You indicated that he sobbed to the point that he almost vomited when he was discussing his daughter becoming involved with Curtis.
That's
Is that
correct. That's correct. He was very upset about that.
When he talked about this incident, he was not sobbing to the point of vomiting, was he?
Well, he was crying in the police car. I did look at those videos. So he was crying in the police car.
In regards to when you're talking to him, he's crying and almost vomiting, is that correct?
Yeah, he was very upset when talking about his daughter and the decisions he believes that she made that were not the best, in his view.
He felt that he was abusive towards her, that he had a prison record, that he took advantage of her, that he was taking financial advantage of him, all those things in regards to Curtis, is that correct?
That's his perceptions, yes. Right or wrong, that's how he feels about his daughter.
You indicated in regards to the facts of this case that is your understanding that the guy on the motorcycle was riding full speed at his daughter, is that correct?
My understanding from reading all the police, I read as much as I possibly could of all the videotapes, the police records, is that he was turning around, that he didn't try to get the bike away and go on other side streets, that he was turning right around and coming back toward the truck and toward Michelle, after having butted Curtis.
Were you aware that in all her taped interviews, all her taped statements, she never once indicates that she was in fear of that bike or the guy on the bike hurting her?
Yes, and that's a very important point because it's not Michelle's fear that we're talking about, it's Mr. Knight's fear that we're talking about. So it's
that's not
different.
With all
Yes.
due respect, I'm asking you about that information.
That's correct.
And I mean, we can follow up, with Mr. O'Brien as to how you interpreted that information.
Right.
But, so you were aware that in a 911 call, she indicates the guy was trying to take off on the dirt bike from my husband to take it away. And my husband was grabbing onto it and trying to stop him from doing so. And then my father has a concealed permit and shot the dude. That's what she said, correct?
I don't remember verbatim, but basically, yes. You're reading it to me, yes.
And when you were asked on direct to tell us what the facts were of the case, you didn't tell us these are just the facts from his perception, right? You told us the facts based upon your review of all the reports. And your explanation was this bike was going full speed at his daughter.
I was able to give a general explanation of what occurred, that there was a motorcycle coming down the street and that there was danger to Michelle. That's my understanding of the situation, as well as to Curtis.
And do you recall saying he was going full speed at Mr. Knight's daughter?
What I know is that he revved up that bike, he did a wheelie and turned around.
Okay, you know that.
I know it from reading the police records.
Okay, well then you also know that she was interviewed for 36 minutes at the police department, and once again, her only involvement was at one point trying to stop Curtis because he was grabbing on to the bike.
Right.
Right, of Keith.
Right.
And she didn't want him getting involved, so her only explanation of anything is trying to stop him, not worried about Keith or the bike or anything that's going to happen to her. Is that true?
That seems to be what she stated, yes. That was not my primary concern in this case, but yes.
And so when you talk about what Mr. Knight said, compared to that, it falls in line with he's not being reasonable, is that correct?
I've never used the word reasonable. That's not a diagnostic term. I don't know what you mean by reasonable.
He's misinterpreting the situation?
He's interpreting the situation based upon his development, his psychological functioning, his recent history, his losses, his feelings about his daughter, his fear, the situation, a multitude of factors. Not about what Michelle thinks, but about what he thinks.
He's potentially misinterpreting the situation, correct?
That is certainly. That's a possibility.
I mean, you can have a person on drugs who's so high, heroin, PCP, that they totally misperceive the situation, correct?
Well, he was not intoxicated at all.
I'm not asking about Mr. Knight right now. I'm asking, you have an experience of being involved in criminal cases, and defendants can be hallucinating from drugs, PCP, cocaine, what have you, and perceive danger that's not there. Is that correct?
That is correct. You can also misperceive because of your development or because you've been traumatized or because you have intellectual deficiencies or a variety of other reasons.
You've testified to that, but I want to talk about individuals on drugs. And would their behavior be excused just because they're so high on drugs that they misperceive the situation?
As you and I know that voluntary intoxication is not a defense. So somebody who's going to voluntarily drink and do something wrong, that's not a defense. That's their choice that they became intoxicated. So they would have a different, the court situation would be very different than the situation.
So the answer is no, they would not be excused if that was the situation?
No, they would probably not be excused.
Okay, thank you.
Unless we're looking at, well, that's another story, but.
On page 3, you indicated when talking about the life of Mr. Knight and his wife, that his anxiety prevented him from taking trips, and you said considering a long trip created considerable anxiety. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Yet when you talked to his sister, you found out that after his wife's death, he went all the way to Arizona to try to meet a lady friend. Is that correct?
He did.
And this was someone who he had a romantic interest in? Is that why he went to Arizona?
I guess you can call it a romantic interest, yes.
And so even though you had been told by him about this great anxiety and not wanting to go anywhere, when you talk to the sister, she's telling you about him going all the way to Arizona to try to meet a lady, correct?
That's correct.
And so that would be kind of inconsistent between the two.
In terms of history, yes.
And so when he talked about not wanting to travel places out of fear, I mean, that could be, one option is he was exaggerating that. Is that an option?
Let me tell you what I believe. I believe he was very protective of Karen. I believe they were very careful what they did during that marriage. I know that he was profoundly lonely after Karen died, and whatever motivated him to take a trip that long, I don't know. But yes, it would not be in line with being afraid to go to a Cleveland Indians game, but it also would be in line with a man who had nothing in his life and was terribly lonely.
Okay, I'll ask the question again. His indicating that he would not go on trips and go out of state, could that have been an exaggeration? Is that an option?
Anything is possible. Anything is possible.
Could he be untruthful about that?
My clinical judgment...
I thought anything is possible. I didn't think that was a tough question.
Okay, anything is possible. Anything is possible. It is possible.
All right. In going through your report, I'm going going to put up some of the descriptive terms that you used for Mr. Knight. And if you need me to reference where they are, I can.
I can't see anything.
I haven't put it up yet.
Okay.
Based upon your analysis of Mr. Knight, it's upside down. You describe him as suspicious? Is that accurate?
If that, I have to find where the word is in the report, but if you say it's in the report, I believe you.
Okay, I mean, I can point them out to you if you don't recall them being there.
No, I would say that I probably used that word.
Okay. On edge,
Certainly,
atypical perceptions of the world,
yes,
may misinterpret situations.
that's correct.
His functioning raises concerns about his ability to make good judgments in stressful situations.
Yes.
Like we talked about.
Yes, we did.
Highly anxious,
For sure,
hypervigilant,
yes,
considers the worst possible scenario, correct?
he does, yes,
Attempts to prove himself as a man is sad and comical.
that was talking about his childhood, about the fighting, you know, the
The high school.
teasing in high school, yes.
And then in regards to when you talked to Michelle, she described him as having a degree of suspicion about the world around him,
I believe so, yes,
heightened anxiety,
yes.
hypochondriacal and overreactive.
Well, we talked about him being somatic, yes, that he is very concerned about his health and about his wife's health,
And
yes.
that's how Michelle described, well, I imagine she didn't use those terms, but
No.
that's in the section of how Michelle described him, correct?
Yes, she-
Overreactive.
Very reactive about how sick his wife was and, well, her mother.
His sister said he's hypervigilant,
Yes,
misinterprets situations,
yes.
and a short fuse.
Well, that short fuse is when someone's going to hurt someone that he loves. The short fuse is not in terms, very important not to take that out of context. That's not fair, because that out of context, the short fuse is protecting someone that he loves. That is what the sister said, not a short fuse in any other type of situation.
She states that her brother has a short fuse, as she puts it, someone is hurting someone that he cares about.
That's correct. That was very clear.
And in regards then to when he's in these fights as a high schooler, and then we jump ahead 46 years, correct, to this incident when he's 63 years old?
Right.
45 years.
Whatever, yeah.
All this overreacting and this state, you don't document any other time where he overreacted violently or got into a physical confrontation for misinterpreting a situation.
I don't recall, no. He had a fairly staid life. Did not have any incidents to show that.
May I have 1 minute, Your Honor? We talked about sources of information that you had. Doctor, we talked about sources of information that you have. We provided defense counsel with a video and an audio from an incident involving Mr. Knight a couple weeks ago. Did you receive that?
I just saw that the other day.
Okay.
Saw that, I think it was last night, I believe. I think it was last night that I saw that.
And I didn't hear that on direct, but I'm going to play this for you now.
Your Honor, we're going to object for playing this video. Relevancy.
So I believe that with the expert's testimony, the defendant has put a pertinent trait of character at issue, that in response to that, then, under Evidence Rule 405, the state is permitted to discuss other specific incidents with the expert related to that pertinent character trait.
Okay.
So I will allow it.
That's all right, I'm collecting it. And we'll mark this as exhibit. All right. And this is the first floor of the courthouse.
Correct.
And the lady whose back is to us would be Keith Johnson's grandmother.
That's my understanding,
I'm told
yes.
that as well. And in front of her is her grandfather.
I can't verify that, that's what I've been told.
That's what you're told.
Yes.
Again, we're going to go as to what you've been told about this incident.
Yes.
Okay? And we're going to hear an audio from Mr. Knight talking to his daughter on a telephone.
Okay.
Correct?
They went to court yesterday, which was, I think it was about 1 month or something. They worked down on the first floor. And so the first floor was that little cafe there with the bars and all stools and stuff. Yeah, that moved along the deputy's car. So the family was sitting there out now and then on the stool. Must have been the grandmother, which I see in court, grandma was on. Her old woman. She's seen me about their food out, and she comes up and starts coming at me. I don't know what was going on, I didn't turn around and look. Of course, I had a couple of girls behind me, you know, whatever. And they go on and
And so the audio there, and I want to make sure this is how you were told, is that Mr. Knight indicated that when the grandmother saw him walking by, that she, words to the effect of she practically spit her food out and started to come at me.
It was very hard to hear, but that's what I heard, yes.
Is that what you were told? I mean, were you able to see this before?
I saw this, yes, and I
Were you
heard,
able to
I heard
listen?
the call too, yes.
Okay, and was that, in essence, was that what Mr. Knight said in that audio?
Yeah, verbatim, a couple of the words were hard to hear, but generally, yes.
Okay, and then we'll show the video of Mr. Knight walking by when the grandmother's present. Well, let me go back.
I don't know what was going on, I didn't turn around and look. Of course, I had a couple of girls behind me, you know, whatever. And they go on She's seen me about their food out, and she comes up and starts coming at me. I don't know what was going on, I didn't turn around and look. Of course, I had a couple of girls behind me, you know, whatever. And they go on.
It appears from the video that when he came out, she looked at him, looked away, and that was pretty much the extent of her reaction.
That's correct, that's correct.
And that would be him either exaggerating, misinterpreting the situation, or being untruthful.
One of those, yes.
And for the record, that's going to be State's Exhibit 17.
Doctor, a few questions. After you interviewed Mr. Knight, you sought corroboration from 2 other sources, is that correct?
That's correct, Mr. Bryan, yes.
His older sister and his daughter, is that correct?
That's correct, sir.
All right. Now, in terms of seeking other sources of information, such as somebody in high school, such as a principal or somebody, his time in high school would have been about, what, 50 years ago?
Yeah, he would have graduated, I think he graduated in like 1972, something like that. So you're talking, I don't know, how many years ago is that? 50 years, well, what's that, 40-some years ago?
Right.
Yes.
In terms of, in addition to the interviews and the other interviews with the sister and the daughter, you also had him go through all this testing, is that correct?
That's correct.
All right. Is that a form of trying to validate or try to, maybe my word, score whether or not it's an honest presentation?
Yes, it provides, all independent testing provides collaboration, because like in this situation, you couldn't find a principal that's deceased or high school students that are now in their 60s. There's limits to what you can do in an evaluation, but testing is one way to firm up results.
And you found this to be a valid and honest presentation, is that correct?
That's correct.
You didn't find any malingering or anything like that, or faking?
No faking, no malingering, no trying to make himself out as worse than he is, not trying to fool the court or myself.
There was some talk about him not wanting to go on any long trips. He led a fairly simple life, did he not?
Very simple, very routine.
And this trip that he took to Arizona occurred after his wife died?
That's correct.
He was lonely, I think you testified to?
Very.
With respect to, he wouldn't have gone to Arizona if his wife had been alive.
No, he would never let Karen be exposed to anything to be that adventurous or dangerous in his
He's
view.
pretty devoted to her, wasn't he?
Unbelievably. This was the only woman he has ever been with and the only woman that he's ever loved. This was his life.
How long was the marriage?
Well, they were married when they were late adolescents, so I guess they were married for 40-some years.
Mr. Baumel asked you about drugs, did he not?
Yes.
All right. And would you agree with me that, or first of all, have you had any experience with people that were on drugs?
A great deal. From a friend, not personally, Mr. Ryan, but yes, from a forensics perspective, yes.
And would you, or how would you characterize people that take drugs and alcohol?
Well, I'm going to be very general here because I have lots of experience with this, but when you have a combination, it depends on what type of drugs, but alcohol in particular is a mood destabilizer. It causes changes in impulse control, causes changes in judgment. Alcohol, that's why you can't drink and drive, because your impulses and your judgment and your reasoning is greatly impaired when you use large amounts of alcohol. And marijuana is also tends to destabilize one's judgment and emotions.
Would either one of these or both cause mood changes?
They do, yes, certainly.
Okay. And could one of those mood changes be road rage?
One of those mood changes could be difficulties in impulse control and emotional control, and it depends on the individual. But yes, what we have with alcohol is a loosening of emotions and a loosening of judgment, which is why people tend to commit crimes and do things that they normally would not do when they're not under the influence of substances, particularly alcohol.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Doctor.
Thank you, Your Honor.
You may step down.
Thank you. May I leave these exhibits here?
Yes, the council will get them over the break. And ladies and gentlemen, we will now take a brief recess for our afternoon break, and about 10 minutes or so, just
All right.